Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening whenever you happen to be listening to this. We're going to be talking chapter 22, Cultural Conflict, Bubble and Bust. So we are going all the way through the Roaring Twenties. Okay, so this is a cover from Life magazine, July 1926. You've got a young woman on the cover. She's considered a flapper. She's between two men who are playing music, likely jazz, because that's what's popular at the time. It celebrates the modernism that was manifest in much of the 1920s culture. The people in the drawing are young. They're enjoying jazz in a commercial setting. The flapper in the image symbolizes the independent new woman who rejected traditional femininity in favor of more revealing clothing, bobbed hair, and expressive sexuality. Presenting those images on a magazine cover that celebrates the 4th of July also suggests that these new elements are quintessentially American. All right. So, after World War I, you have a lot of soldiers who are coming home, and the return of these war veterans, especially Black War veterans, is going to start to cause some racial strife. African Americans are determined to achieve citizenship rights after World War I. So technically they have them because of the 14th and 15th Amendments, but they're not effective. Nobody is standing up for them. Legislation is counting against them, things like Plessy versus Ferguson, allowing segregation. And they go over to Europe and they kind of see that things are different, and it definitely causes a problem. You have an increase of black migrants to the north that is going to be led to backlash by whites. You have lynchings in the south that are going to rise. You have 48 in 1917, but 78 in 1919. And as we've talked before, when we talk lynching in American history, we do generally mean a black person hung or killed by a group of white people. But just understand that is not the textbook definition. Lynching means an individual who's mobbed by a group of people. Several black men are lynched in uniform. There's a lynching in Rosewood, Florida in 1921 that leads to black residents arming themselves. Mobs of white burn their houses and attack black citizens with no intervention by the police. Again, big problem. There are large numbers of blacks, immigrants, and whites seeking work and housing, which is going to increase the tension in the northern cities. You have deadly riots in East St. Louis in 1917, in Chicago 1919. You have an alleged rape in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which leads to a white mob aided by the National Guard, burning 35 blocks of Greenwood, Oklahoma, and killing several dozen blacks. So obviously racial tensions super, super high. All right. As far as labor rights are concerned, the National War Labor Board increased workers' expectation of what employers could do for them. Post-war conditions changed. Workers are obviously frustrated. During 1919, 1 in 5 U.S. workers went on strike. U.S. Steel hired Mexican and black workers to break strikes, and new industries sought to hire non-union employees. In 1919, Boston police force went on strike over the right to form a union. Governor Coolidge fired the entire force. This was supported by the public and by the anti-labor Supreme Court rulings. Union membership fell from 5.1 million in 1920 to 3.6 million in 1929. Quite a lot. Henry Ford and some other employers took on some responsibility for employees' well-being, providing health insurance, old age pensions, athletic facilities, and paid vacations, hoping this would build a loyal workforce and head off labor unrest. These plans covered only 5% of the industrial workforce. So only 5%. All right. So because of the Bolshevik Revolution that occurs during World War I, what happens in Russia is the Bolsheviks overthrow the Tsar, and basically it's a monarchy, the ruling class, and they take over Russia under the form of communism. All right, so there is a high fear of Russian Bolsheviks in the United States. It coincides with the rising cost of living, so it's up 80% between 1917 and 1919. You have new immigrants who are socialist. The U.S. Communist Party is small. There's fewer than 70,000 people. But the Bolsheviks' founding of the Third International Comintern in 1919 increased fears among Americans that they would seek a revolution in the United States. April of 1919, you have the Palmer raids. 34 mail bombs were sent to government officials. In June, a bomb exploded outside the home of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Palmer established an anti-radicalism division in the Justice Department, so wrong person to bomb. The FBI named J. Edgar Hoover to direct it. So this is where we get the FBI, and Hoover being the first director of the FBI. In November, raids of radical organizations began. Raids peaked in January 1920 with the arrest of 6,000 radicals. The situation abates by the summer. Sacco and Vanzetti, those are the two gentlemen down on the bottom, I believe. Sacco is the one on the right. I might be wrong, but anyway. May of 1920, Nicola Sacco, who is a shoemaker, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, who is a fish peddler, were arrested in Massachusetts for the murder of 2 men during a holdup. These self-proclaimed anarchists were convicted and sentenced to death despite lack of evidence and clear bias of the prosecutor. They were basically the poster child of what will happen to you if you are a socialist, or you are an anarchist, or you are a communist. If you are not what we want you to be, this is what could happen to you. They actually, there's evidence that was not depicted during the trials. They were basically just tried in the court of public opinion based on their political beliefs, not on what they had actually done. So, all right. Let's see. Shepard-Towner Federal Maternity and Infancy Act. So progressive women hoped voting rights would lead to the passage of important legislation in the 1920s. This act provides federal money for medical clinics, prenatal education, and visiting nurses. So this is the first time Congress gave money directly to states to administer social welfare. Critics claimed it would create socialized medicine, and it ends in the late 1920s. So people have this really big fear of socialism. Even today, people are like, oh, socialist medicine, terrible, terrible thing. I don't know if it's more fear of the unknown or if it's fear that it will take over democracy. But either way. 1923, Alice Paul of the National Women's Party persuaded congressional allies to consider an equal rights amendment to the Constitution, which stated, men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States. Opponents objected on the basis that it would threaten recently won protective legislation for women. So 1923, this is after the 19th Amendment is passed in 1920. And Alice Paul is one of the people that helps get that amendment passed. So this is what she does afterwards. She works on an equal rights amendment. It hits Congress several times over the years, but it has never been passed, obviously, because you don't know anything about equal rights amendment. All right. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So it's an international peace organization created in 1919. Jane Addams was a founding member. Remember her, of Hull House and the settlement houses. Protested imperialism and the negative repercussions of militarism, and criticized during the Red Scare. So, Red Scare, 1920s and 1950s. So we will have another one when we hit the 1950s after World War II. All right. This gentleman here on the left is Warren Harding. He's an Ohio senator who promised normalcy. He runs for president in 1924? No, 1920. He's 1920. Yeah, runs for 1920. So right after World War I, he's going to promise normalcy. He's going to win in a landslide over James Cox. He appoints Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce. And he dies of a heart attack in August of 1923. So many scandals during his time as president. He has never been connected to any of them, though, but it does definitely color his presidency. And it also causes a lot of distrust in the office of the president. One of the big ones is the Teapot Dome scandal, which basically, I think it's one of the cabinet members, can't remember which one, Albert Falls is his name, but I don't know what his position was. Maybe Secretary of the Interior. Anyway, he under the table leased lands in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and there's another location too, but they always call it Teapot Dome scandal, to oil companies, and basically took a kickback for it. And it was protected land, so there was obviously issues there. On the right, we have Calvin Coolidge. He wanted limited government, isolationism, and tax cuts for businesses. Republicans don't want to continue most progressive measures from the 1910s, and they do not enforce antitrust laws. So Calvin Coolidge is the next president in 1923. I think he takes over for Harding. Anyway, moving on. All right, all three Republican presidents in the 1920s wanted private banks to make loans to foreigners. They were hoping to stimulate the U.S. economy by increasing demand for products. Banks wanted the government to ensure that loans would be paid back, even by unstable governments. Banks gave loans with conditions such as oversight by bank commissions and military force by the United States. The U.S. Marine occupation of Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti began as part of forced repayment. The Americans saw these lands as possessions. Critics denounced loan guarantees and military intervention as dollar diplomacy. African Americans criticized American involvement in Haiti. And WILPF, visitors to Haiti in 1926, claimed that the United States soldiers were exploiting, that would be terrible, Haitian women. There are calls for isolation, forced presidents to defend these foreign relationships. Again, we want to stay out of everything. We don't want to be involved in anything after World War I. All right. Prohibition. So this is ratified, 18th Amendment is passed in 1917, and it's ratified in 1920, so same time women get the vote. Rural and native-born Protestants wanted prohibition. They aided by calls that drinking German beer was unpatriotic during World War I. And the 18th Amendment prohibits the manufacture, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors. Then we have the Scopes monkey trial. So state and local school boards in some areas wanted to mandate school curriculum based on biblical teachings. Tennessee took the lead on this by outlawing the teaching of any theory that did not hold biblical teaching central to the existence of humans. Today, it's the exact opposite. I can promise you, if your teacher were teaching you biblical teachings, somebody would have a problem with it, and that would end up in court. The American Civil Liberties Union intervened in the case of John Scopes, who was a high school biology teacher who faced a jail sentence for teaching evolution. The press called the case a monkey trial. That's why it's called the Scopes monkey trial. The jury took 8 minutes to find Scopes guilty. Later, the Tennessee Supreme Court does overturn it. And Scopes actually volunteered to test the law, so it wasn't like he was just trying to be a rogue. All right, nativism. We talked about this when we were going over the practice test. It's fears about unrestricted immigration by native-born Protestants who believe them to be the cause of problems in the United States. Again, the idea that we are better than. Catholics and Jews were targets of hostility. Coolidge says America must be kept American. Argues that immigrants undermine Christianity, imported anarchism and socialism. You have the National Origins Act of 1924, which used the 1890 census to determine how many people could enter from individual nations. It further restricted immigration from Europe in 1929. Immigrants from Western Hemisphere were unrestricted, leading to increasing numbers of Latin American immigrants, including 1 million Mexicans. The Great Depression led to cuts in immigration from Mexico. Hostility towards Asians grew in California, which passed a law making illegal for non-citizens to own property. Anyway, you have the National Klan, the KKK, following Birth of a Nation in 1915 film. The KKK grew, targeting Jews and Catholics. They ran for political offices and won more than 3 million members at height. Election of 1928, Catholic Governor Al Smith, who was a Democrat from New York, ran against Herbert Hoover, Secretary of Commerce. The opponents, no governor can kiss the papal ring and get within gunshot of the White House. Catholic fear, people don't like Catholics. Our first Catholic president doesn't happen until JFK, and I believe he's the only one that we've ever had. Hoover won 58% of the popular vote and 444 electoral votes. So you can see that right here. Alfred Smith. Interestingly enough, in the South, the Bible South, voting for the Catholic, but largely because he was a Democrat. All right, Harlem. So black population of New York triples between 1910 and 1920. Black artists and writers migrate to Harlem. Writers like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and Jean Toomer published works that championed black pride. Zora Neale Hurston documented black folklore, songs, and religious beliefs she incorporated into short stories and novels. She is a fantastic author. If you ever have a chance to read one of her books, I highly suggest it. Most visible piece of Harlem culture for most Americans started in New Orleans before World War I. You have a combination of blues, ragtime, and other musical forms. Improvised solo made trumpeter Louis Armstrong a star. The radio helped grow the nationwide popularity of jazz. The 1920s saw the advent of companies producing race records for black audience and records for immigrant communities in native languages. So really trying to cater to people and making sure everybody has something to buy. You have the Universal Negro Improvement Association. It's formed in 1920s in Harlem. Marcus Garvey, who was born in Jamaica, advocated black separatism, claimed to have 4 million followers. He published Negro World and sought to create a steamship company to bring blacks back to Africa. Many of them aren't from Africa at this point. They've lived in the United States for hundreds of years. Anyway, let's see. Black Starline Garvey imprisoned for mail fraud and deported in 1925. He's a symbol of emerging Pan-Africanism, the idea that people of African descent had a common destiny and should cooperate in political action. Yeah. This picture right here is going to depict people in a dance club, probably in New York or Chicago. All the people are African American. Some are dancing, some are playing music, some are listening while they drink cocktails. So all that fun music out of the 1920s, that ragtime, that jazz, it comes out of Harlem, and it's very lively. And this painting is part of the Harlem Renaissance. And again, it's very lively. It's very colorful. It celebrates black culture, its music, and its people. Like the work of Zora Neale Hurston and others, the painting articulates and celebrates what it meant to be both a Negro and an American. Excuse me. All right, post-World War I voices proclaimed growing dissent. You have Gertrude Stein, called Those Who Survived the War the Lost Generation. John Dos Passos criticized the war in The Three Soldiers in 1921. It's a book, as did Ernest Hemingway in A Farewell to Arms in 1929. Examinations of the dark side of human beings. You have Eugene O'Neill in Desire Under the Elms and The Emperor Jones. Sinclair Lewis criticized conformity in Babbitt. And Lewis was the first American to win a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1930. Not for Babbitt, but for something else. F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby in 1925 criticized the pursuit of pleasure and wealth. And we love that movie today. Anyway, in that book. By the 1920s, corporations were the major form of business in the United States. A few major producers were at the top of most markets, the oligopoly. Like a monopoly, very similar, but instead of one owner, you have several owners. Mergers between banks made Wall Street the financial center of the United States. Post-World War I inflation was followed by 2 years of recession with 10% unemployment. Between 1922 and 1929, the national per capita income rose. Despite the boom, U.S. economy had weak agricultural sector due to falling prices. Coal and textile industries languished for similar reasons. And rural Americans did not benefit from prosperity. But I will also tell you, when the Great Depression hits, they're the ones who were hit even harder. So they don't benefit from the prosperity, and they are probably dinged even more during the Great Depression. All right, we have mass production by Henry Ford that's going to lead to America's spending $2.58 billion in automobiles in 1929, thanks to Henry Ford and his Model T, available to the everyday public. Other industries are stimulated with this: the steel, petroleum, chemical, rubber, and glass. The suburbs are going to grow. New shopping centers are developed, and it hurts the railroad industry because now people have their own cars. They can go their own places. It changed the way people spent their leisure time. In Hollywood, by 1910, the movie-making industry was growing in California on cheap land. Young sheep land. Can you imagine that today? Sheep land in California. Young people followed the fashions of movie actors and actresses, including flapper Clara Bow. Flappers represented the social and sexual emancipation for women. And this over here is our friend Charlie Chaplin. All right. You see his little mustache. Yeah, that becomes out of vogue after Hitler, just FYI. All right. Over here on the right, this is a beach in Jacksonville, Florida in 1929. It is covered with parked cars that have carried people to the beach for the day. There are many people walking toward the beach on a very nice day. You see the nice blue sky, the clear ocean. The photograph suggests the wider availability and affordability of cars. All right, people can take them where they want to go. Yay! All right, too much lending, $7 billion per year by 1927. A drop in consumer spending as credit becomes more difficult to get. Global economic problems. We had a lot of problems in Europe after World War I. Adherence to the gold standard, which the British and Germans have abandoned with some positive results in 1931. These are the causes of the Great Depression. And there's even more. Basically, people are borrowing a lot of money. They don't have the money to pay it back. It's going to cause bank failures a little way down the road. Credit is kind of it's not a new thing, but it's more widely used. And people are actually speculating on the stock market. And what that means is they are saying that they want to buy stocks, but they don't have the money to pay for them. But they say they want to buy them in the assumption that the stock's going to go up, they're going to make their money, and they're not going to have to pull out of pocket to pay for it. Because most of them don't have it. Again, today that's illegal. You can't do that today. So the effects. During the first 4 years of the Great Depression, the production fell 37%, construction fell 78%, and by 1932, unemployment had reached 24%. Americans cut back dramatically, and falling demand deepened the crisis. Bank failures. Desperate people turned to private charity for aid. Couples delayed marriage. The birth rate fell to a historic low, and African Americans were more deeply affected than whites. And I'm going to make the large assumption that your next chapter is going to talk heavily about the Great Depression. But leaving you with this, the stock market crashes in 1929 and everything goes to pot after that. It is not the cause of the Great Depression. There are numerous causes of the Great Depression, and a lot of it has to do with the way people were living their lives in the 1920s. That boom time leads to the Great Depression, along with the long-lasting effects of World War I. So I hope I see you soon. I hope you have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, and we'll chat later. Bye.